Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terence, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. Our subject today is the graphic memoir Fun Home, which caused some controversy this year when students at Duke University protested the book being assigned to the Common Reading List. Joining me to discuss the topic today are Hector Miray, author of Faith and Fandom, and Kevin Freeman, the president of Action Lab Entertainment. Gentlemen, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
So let's get started talking about Fun Home. Now this is, I think, a beautiful story about the parallels that a woman sees in her own life and that of her father. And it was sort of controversial because of the, I guess, the content, which is, of course, that she's sort of realizing that she's a lesbian, and she discovers that her father has been a closeted gay man, and then he's, of course, tragically killed before she can, I guess, have a real deep discussion with him on the matter. So I just wanted to find out what your thoughts were, and Kevin, we'll start with you. Should a college student coming in, fresh from high school, object to something that is being assigned as reading material?
No, I don't think so, and here's why. I mean, college is a place for higher learning, of course. And people come to college, one of the reasons people should come to college is to be challenged by things that might not necessarily fit into their viewpoint, their point of view, their ideology. It's good to be challenged from the outside, to be exposed to things that you might not necessarily be comfortable with. And even if you don't necessarily agree with the subject material, just learning about different perspectives and learning about coming of life stories like this one, and as you said, it's a beautiful memoir, is good to stimulate the brain, and it's good just to learn how to critically think. It's good to learn how to understand things that might not necessarily fit with what you think they should be. So, I mean, it's good from that perspective.
And it is interesting because, again, this is sort of the common reading list for incoming freshmen, so they can have, I guess, either courses that will discuss the topic, or so that they can, speak with their peers and have sort of a common ground other than, the new Nicki Minaj album or something like that. Well, you've read the book and you said it's a beautiful story. Why would a student object to reading something like this, in your opinion?
Well, it is controversial subject material. It talks about homosexuality, not only of the author, but also of the author's father, as you mentioned, who kind of lives his life in the closet as a gay man. There are a few panels, really just one page, I think, is the primary area where there is some controversy, where there is a sex scene between two women. But that is just really a tiny, tiny part of the story. The story is much more of a coming out story. It's a woman who is coming to terms with what she is and who she is, and her father serves as an interesting parallel and an interesting foil to her own development. And so the primary part that I think a lot of the students have issue with is really just a teeny, tiny part of the story. And there are plenty of works of famous literature that people do read that contain equally kinds of controversial material. It just so happens that this is an illustrated book rather than a work of prose, and so I think it hits a little harder in that regard.
All right. Hector, now you've written a series of books, Faith and Fandom, and you had the opportunity to read Fun Home yesterday. What are your thoughts on the controversy and the novel itself, or the memoir itself?
On the memoir itself, honestly, I sat down to read it, and just picking it up, like, I stayed with it. I didn't get up once during reading it. It was just because it is someone's personal story. I think that's just one of the things that I think it's not just fiction or anything like this. Is someone's actual life story, and like knowing that, and I'd seen a TV interview with Allison that wrote the book before, and I think I just was reading it from a perspective of empathy, of just like seeing where her struggle was, seeing where her family had come through. And honestly, controversial material, I know, as Professor Freeman mentioned, the homosexuality aspect of it, that didn't throw me as much. Honestly, I say when I did turn to like a couple pages, I was like, oh. And it was like the moment I was like, okay, I could see that, being an issue. But I think the book is 240 pages. And there's literally maybe 3 pages of nudity and 1 sex scene. And with that, you're talking about drawing, and it's not like it's graphic depiction. It's a couple black and white lines on a page. But I think it does cause it to hit a little bit harder, but you know, coming into a collegiate level, I just, you know, being at Duke, being in a collegiate aspect, I don't know necessarily that I would feel like 2 or 3 pages out of a book would cause me to, you know, protest or to object heavily. I remember being in high school and reading Things Fall Apart, and I just remember, you know, it wasn't graphic sexual content, but I just remember reading that novel and thinking, this is hardcore, and like I felt uncomfortable reading some of that stuff just being a teenager, but I read it. And, you know, if you disagree with everything that's ascribed to you for school, for class, you know, you're not going to advance very far. I mean, the flip side, this wasn't required, correct? This was the common reading list. Mm-hmm. This was, we want you to have this as a unifying object. And if these students didn't necessarily want to read it, they didn't have to. The protest of it, I don't know how much that actually accomplishes other than that. I did find it kind of ironic, though, that Christian students were protesting it, and there's one image or graphic in the book where Allison is protesting Christians, and I was like, oh, irony.
It is interesting, and like you said, there are maybe, I think, 6 panels in a book of 241 pages, multiple panels on each page. There are about 6 panels that depict nudity, and I believe 2 that depict sexual intimacy. And it seems strange to me in higher education that a student would just dismiss it. He wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post where he said basically that it wasn't so much the subject matter as it was those 6 images or so, and that he would not look at Renaissance art for the same reason, because it deeply offended his deeply held personal sensibilities. So in a world where we have films that are ultra-violent and they say sex sells, you can't look at a movie poster that features a female character without seeing her physical assets, you know, on display. Do you think that it's possible for someone to be in a situation where they're confronted with something for the first time by reading a book like this, or?
I've met students here who have not seen pornography in any aspect at UNCP. Few, very few. Usually ones that come from like strong or very strict families. You know, not to further a stereotype, usually homeschool families that they've come to college and they've been very sheltered. They've been very guarded. And sometimes that's the parents, sometimes that's the student themselves to say, I'm choosing to not view these things. And if this is their first experience seeing that, then I could understand a little being upset about that. I remember being in high school and my high school science teacher showed a Sharon Stone movie that was like chock full of nudity in 9th grade science. And you know, there were kids literally losing their mind in the classroom. And but I think when you're an 18-year-old and coming to this, if you haven't been exposed to that yet, I assume that it would be alarming, but I think it's very few and far between that this would be the most graphic thing they've ever seen. Not that, you know, that necessarily, you know, excuses it, but if it is something that they choose to abstain from viewing for their personal religious convictions, and I get that Scripture says not to set anything impure before your eyes. And if you can honestly hold to that conviction and you honestly want to live that out, I could see a problem with that. But it's not the most graphic thing I think a student's seen at this point.
I'm assuming that you were about to start dissecting frogs, and that's why the teacher was showing you that Sharon Stone movie. That's the only logical explanation I can have on that subject.
But I mean, there's equally as graphic images in plenty of movies that people see that are in theaters and wide release. I mean, the movie that always pops into my head is Black Swan, in comparing this, and there's a similar scene in Black Swan that millions of people watched, of course, and it was nominated for Oscars. And so to me, this is no different from that, really.
Well, Kevin, let's talk about, I guess, move away from the controversy and just talk about the book itself. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I noticed was she writes a lot about the distance between herself and her parents and how they really, it wasn't a traditional family. She refers to it as sort of an artist colony where everyone's doing their own thing. And I was just wondering, as someone who's been a successful writer and who is in charge of a comic book company. When you read something like this, well, one, I'm assuming that there's a degree of jealousy, because I know I was a bit jealous looking at this. I just wanted to get your thoughts from just I guess, the writing and art standpoint and how that impacts you.
Sure, the writing is brilliant, and one of the things that's really neat about it, and you mentioned this a little bit yourself about the distance that we see in her family, and I think that those feelings are very clear in how she writes. I mean, you can it's kind of a cold, standoffish sort of script, and I think it's very intentional about how distant she sees herself compared to a lot of people in her family. But at the same time, there's a lot of under-seated emotion there that she wants to be closer to her dad. She wants to share stories with her dad. She finds other outlets in her life to kind of substitute for that. She has the ability to create emotion and lack of emotion that I think a lot of writers would really starve to be able to get that kind of skill.
Well, it is interesting because she, as you say, she depicts this lack of emotion, but at the same time, when you are reading it, it's very emotional. Yeah. So it's also interesting because she seems to be trying to connect with her father after the fact through this novel. And I think towards the end she says that this is, as much his story as it is hers. So let's say someone comes to you with an idea like this for a graphic novel or graphic memoir. How would you approach this from the very practical side of how are we going to make money off of this?
Well, it's a tricky question because not every publisher is suitable for every sort of material, if that makes sense. There are a lot of publishers out there who would jump at the chance to print something like that. And while a company like Action Lab or Marvel or DC or some of the more mainstream publishers, they probably would not publish that book for the simple fact that it doesn't fit terribly well in sort of the genre, the milieu that they are trying to create with their universes, if that makes sense. But there are plenty of publishers out there like Drawn and Quarterly and like Fantagraphics and Top Shelf and several others who that is right in their wheelhouse. So I think, but even from myself, even though that might not be particularly the type of material that we would publish at Action Lab, you still can recognize it for the fact that it is an exquisite piece of literature that deserves to be printed somewhere, and I'm glad it was printed.
Now, Hector, Kevin just made a point that this would be considered literature, and a lot of what you do in the Faith and Fandom series is look at contemporary media, whether it's film, video games, television, and writing, comics, and look for a spirituality to it. So when we look at a comic, we generally think, hey, kids, comics. And then we have this book that's clearly made for an adult audience. So I was just wondering, in your research, when you've gone through different, I guess, forms of entertainment, how do you determine what is and what isn't, that great work of literature, and what medium should you work in? It's kind of an odd question, I know, but
normally I only pursue things that actually speak to me personally, because I'll always get people say, oh, do this and do this. Why haven't you written about Harry Potter yet or Star Wars? And it's just the things that I don't really want to write about it unless it actually speaks to me. It's I was telling you earlier, I'm not writing right now, but after watching this upcoming season of Doctor Who and a new Star Wars movie and things like that, that will most likely trigger something that I'll pursue that. But I think if you read a story, see a story portrayed in a medium that actually speaks to you, then it's worth, that's usually what we share with anybody, is we share the stories that actually matter to us. We share the stories and we explore the conversations of the things that actually impact us. And that's always been kind of my guiding star of anything I actually put my time into to read or to express once I've read it.
And that's a great point. If something connects to you as a reader, it shouldn't matter the medium that you're getting it through.
Terence, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
How much of the controversy tied to Fun Home and other kinds of graphic novels that we see on occasion that get a similar kind of treatment, how much of it do you think is maybe tied to this stereotype, and you mentioned this a second ago, that comics are for kids and this isn't for kids?
Well, I would kind of say, I remember when I was in high school, if I wanted to talk to the few friends that I knew who read comics, we would do it very quietly because we didn't want to get punched. And so when we got to the point where Dark Knight came out and Watchmen came out, we could kind of say, well, we've got books that show that they're not just for kids. I think you still have people who look at comics as the 1966 Batman, bam, pow, and you always see that if, let's say, the New York Times is writing an article about comics. They're not just for kids, bam, pow, Batman, they'll always, you know, then, but you should read this book. And it always sort of puts it in that mindset of comics are for kids. And as somebody who is a fan of the medium as a way of telling stories, I think that that's like saying, well, because Dr. Seuss wrote books that have you know, words in them, that just any book is for kids. And Barney's on television, so television's just for kids. So I think it's kind of throwing the bathwater out with the baby, if that makes any sense.
Perfect sense.
Okay, well, I answered a question. I almost sound logical. It'll happen from time to time. Now, Hector, we were talking about sci-fi and Doctor Who, and I remember when that show first became popular, I remember in the 3rd grade, it was I don't know which number doctor it was, but it was the one with the long scarf. And a number of the kids at school, that was number 3?
4.
Number 4, would have that scarf and they would talk about Doctor Who. And science fiction, again, kind of has that mindset that it's for kids. And you talked about how things speak to you. I think when we watch something, and you were a fan of Firefly.
Yeah.
And that's one of those shows that has a deeper meaning beyond what we're just seeing on the surface. So I just wondering if you could speak to how we as an audience sort of dismiss things based on the presentation. It's $1 million question.
It's $1 million question. I think honestly, just if it's not in the presentation we're familiar with, and it's not the presentation that we're looking for, we just categorize it with what our stereotypes and our biases are. Honestly, when I picked up Fun Home, I didn't expect the emotional journey that ensued. Just because I see the similar situation in a lot of students that I work with, that I spend time with here on campus, and I see that in lives of my friends and things like that. And you know, it's just I wasn't expecting that when I picked it up. But it's really easy for people to write off and almost be ignorant to any genre that doesn't fit into their comfort zone. To just with that, and that some of the best stories that are told these days are in video games. When you've got a 50-hour story that you can lay out over time, it's like 5 seasons of television, but people will never, half the world will never know the story that's being told because they're not going to sit there and push buttons for 50 hours. And
look at how science fiction and fantasy has really struggled to get recognized in film and television as well. It took, excuse me, it took the 3rd Lord of the Rings movie, Return of the King, before fantasy and film really started to get some notoriety as being, this is a genre that you could tell good emotional stories in. And then with the breakthrough of Game of Thrones with the Emmy Awards this year, I mean, it's really the first time that a science fiction or fantasy story has really gotten kind of the critical acclaim, not just from the voices of the critics, but also from hardware, from trophies. So there are a lot of stereotypes, just like with comics, that need to be overcome, and people need to understand that literature really can be any medium. I mean, you can tell fantastic, deep, meaningful stories with any kind of genre, with any kind of setting, at any kind of time frame. So, you know, hopefully we're moving up in the world.
Well, it's interesting because, as you can tell by my many decorations here, I'm a big fan of the original Star Trek series. And one of the things that NBC did when they were scheduling that program was they were trying to put it on in a time slot that the kids would watch it. And then they would get upset that Gene Roddenberry, the producer, was trying to tackle issues of racism or sexism or the Cold War in this hour-long TV series featuring the great William Shatner. And he had a hard time explaining to them that, you know, look, this is a way to tell a story that you can't tell any other way. No one's going to sit through a half an hour or an hour show about the Cold War, but if I can put it in space, now you're going to pay attention to it, and maybe you'll say, oh, you know what, that's kind of like the U.S.-Soviet relations. Mm-hmm. So it is interesting when we see that sort of dismissal by I guess, the gatekeepers or the powers that be, which is, again, what makes it so sad about this young man at Duke University who is, you know, basically saying, I don't want to read this book because there are pictures that will make me uncomfortable, when there's a great story in there that could make him feel something about his own family just because, oh, you know what, I'm lucky I've got a family that isn't as distant.
One thing just, you know, with that after reading it and after going through it, this story is one person's story. It's one person's journey through it. And if you dismiss a person's story, especially, you know, just looking at her story, if you dismiss her story, that's basically like writing her off as a person. To say, I choose not to acknowledge the journey that your life is going. I choose not to acknowledge what you're going through. And if you are a Christian, if you are someone that actually, that's your goal, is to love others and to be kind and compassionate to them and actually live out a Christ-like manner, you can't write people off just because their life is different than yours and that you disagree with them. And I think if he would have responded in a different manner, he could have probably turned something positive out of the situation. He's like, I read this, you know, I'm not a fan of these 5 pictures, but here's, you know, where my heart connects with the story.
Right. That was one of the problems that I saw with this student refusing to read it, was that if you have, even if it's something that you disagree with, you have to be able to understand where that person's coming from. So if I've got a belief that, you know, the New York Mets they're my favorite team, if I'm going to talk to a New York baseball fan and he's a Yankee fan, I'm going to know who Derek Jeter is because I need to understand that so I can say Jeter stinks, which he does. But, you know, dismissing something based on a subject matter, like you say, it just doesn't it doesn't make you a better person just by saying I'm not going to read
It
something.
reminds me of a classic line from an old George Carlin skit of, how do you know you won't like it if you've never even tried it?
It's true. I never liked broccoli as a child, but, you know, I'll eat the heck out of some broccoli now.
There you go.
I think too, if the issue really was just the graphic 5 or 6 images, he could have easily avoided those, or that could have been something that, you know, if they wanted to throw out a disclaimer, hey, there's nudity on pages 29 and 43, skip those pages, and move on with the story if that was the content of it.
Mm-hmm. It is true, and I even found that I looked less at the images than I did just kind of read the words anyway, because towards that part of the story, she's really reflecting on her, I guess, posthumous relationship with her father. So whatever the images are, it's just, I think, just summing up, you know, where she was in her life rather than what the words are on the page.
And the images, with the few graphic images, if you actually look at the thought process and the dialogue that's on the paper, it's not anything actually about what's going on the page. It's more of just her in the back of her mind.
Well, I see we have about 5 minutes left, so I thought what we could do is talk a little bit about what we're currently, I guess, excited by in either comics or sci-fi. Obviously, I enjoyed the heck out of this, and one of the things that I picked up over the summer was it was called a silent novel, and it was written by Milt Gross, who was a cartoonist in the 20s and 30s. He did a newspaper strip called Gross Exaggerations, and he did sort of satirical cartoon novels, 300 pages, called He Done Her Wrong, and it was very much like a silent film. Each page is another part of the story, and you just kind of flip through. So instead of being panels, it's just single panel gags, and it's all silent. There's no sound effects, there's no dialogue. And what I really found interesting about that was that it really, to me, it captured a lot of those classic silent films where, you know, the 2 men go off and one has to heroically stay behind and the other one steals the girl and he's got to go and, you know, the other one's got to come back and find her. To me, there was another find this summer was He'd Done Her Wrong, and I think you could probably pick up a used copy from Fantagraphics, did a reprint a few years back, and I think I paid all of $7 for it used on eBay. So if anyone has the opportunity to go out and pick that one up, I suggest you do. Is there anything that you've been looking at lately, sci-fi games, reading?
I've been playing Destiny a lot lately. It's a game just expanded, but one of the problems was that they hired Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones to voice your companion, and but they put no story to the game. So they released an expansion that took Peter Dinklage out of the game and then put like hours of story. And so that's been nice, and I'm really looking forward to the Dark Knight 3, the Frank Miller expansion. I'm frightened of what it could be, but kind of hopeful at the same time.
Of course, I'm excited to take my 6-year-old to see the new Star Wars movie over Christmas, because that was almost the exact same age that I was when the first movie came out, when my dad took me to it. But as far as comics, I'm kind of in mourning right now because one of my favorite series of all time recently ended. It's Mind Management by Matt Kent, published by Dark Horse. It was 36 issues, very conspiracy theory kind of story arc. Matt Kent is one of my favorite creators. I've known his work for a long time. He and I know each other fairly well, I suppose. So I always shed a little tear when one of your favorite stories has to come to an end.
You know, it's funny because we were talking about the Frank Miller and you know, coming to an end. Frank Miller, from what I understand, his health may or may not be that great, so he's not even doing the art in the third Dark Knight story. He's I forget who's doing the art.
I don't know. Yeah.
But it's interesting to see that, you know, he's just writing. Actually, he's kind of just doing the plot, and someone else is writing the dialogue for it.
I believe that's right. Yeah.
So that's
Brian Vaughn.
Is it Brian Vaughn? I don't know.
I think so.
So it's kind of sad to see one of your I guess idols, at least for me growing up, not able to answer the bell anymore. But you know, high hopes that the Dark Knight 3 will be a little bit better than the second Dark Knight series was.
Yeah.
It is hard to top the original Dark Knight.
Of course.
Well, there's all the controversy that surrounded 9/11 that kind of shifted the storyline of the second book series as it was coming out. They kind of halted production, right? Mm-hmm. And then had to change the whole story. After the first book to the 2 and 3, the whole story shifted.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I never got past the first book. So I guess in the last few minutes that we have left, Kevin, video games. Are you a fan of the video game? People are saying that video games will be where the next great stories come from, that we won't just watch movies, we'll sort of make them as we play the game.
I really don't play a whole lot of video games, to be perfectly honest. I mean, the only game that I play on a regular basis is probably one that neither of you have heard of. It's called Football Manager. It's a soccer simulation game, but no, I don't really have time to play a lot of stuff, unfortunately.
Okay. And Hector is, I guess because you are always sort of consuming media, is there a show that you can tell us about that we should keep an eye on upcoming season?
I'm enjoying Doctor Who season 9. So far, there's 2 episodes deep. I really like the current Doctor. I'm pretty alone in that, but I am my family actually just started watching Downton Abbey.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm being told that we have to wrap up. I'd like to thank you for watching Comic Culture. I'd like to thank my guests, Hector Miray and Kevin Freeman, for being with us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much.